G'day again everybody, it's good to have you joining me for this lesson. We're going to walk through a high-level overview of the different Azure management tools that you can use. So you're going to learn about the Azure Portal, Azure CLI, and using PowerShell with Azure. Now before we go on, I will just say this is going to be a really high-level overview to what these tools are and some tips for how you can use them, because you could really have an entire course on just Azure CLI or just Azure PowerShell itself. So let's go ahead and jump in, and we'll start off with the first and most obvious management tool, the Azure Portal. Now the Azure Portal is pretty much what you see on the left-hand side of the screen here. It's just a simple web interface that provides all different sorts of management capabilities for working with Azure. This isn't something that you need to install. It's something that you can really easily access through the web browser by going to https://portal.azure.com. The great thing about that is it's really simple to use. If you've got a browser, which obviously you do if you're accessing this content, you can go and access the Azure Portal. You might be running on Mac, Windows, Linux, whatever operating system you like. Now, traditionally, when we worked with the Azure Portal, it was a little bit limited at times in terms of what sort of configuration and things you could do. But really, these days, any sort of management function that you can perform anywhere else, you can pretty much always perform in the Azure Portal as well. Now, you're going to be using the Azure Portal a fair amount when you work through my content, so let's just walk through some quick tips that might help you out. If you've not worked with the Azure Portal before, one of the first screens you're going to see is the home screen, kind of like you see here in this little screenshot. The home screen is just your central, easy-to-use interface that provides access to all of the different services that are available in Azure. It also has shortcuts to the recently used services and recently accessed resources, and really it's just that central home screen you're going to be using a lot when you work with the Azure Portal. One thing that you may or may not choose to use is the menu that's available on the top left-hand side of the screen. When you click on this menu, you'll get access to a range of different Azure services. So you can click on that and go and access any services that you've got deployed for that type, or you can go and easily go and deploy some services of that type if you don't yet have any available. Now this menu is customizable. You can actually choose to pin your favorite services there so they're easily available and in reach. Now the last little quick tip I have for you when you're working with the Azure Portal is that you can also search for resources, services, or documentation by browsing up to the top of the screen and clicking on the search bar and entering in some keywords. This will provide you easy access to resources that you've deployed, service centers that you want to go and use, or as I say, even documentation. So everybody, that's the Azure Portal, a nice, easy to use web browser experience for managing your Azure services. The next tool I want to introduce you to is called Azure CLI, which is short for the command line interface. Now this is a tool that you do have to install, but it does provide you the ability to go and manage, configure, and deploy all sorts of resources through the command line interface. So like you can see here on the screen, if you want to use some sort of terminal or shell environment where you can go and just simply enter in a range of different commands via the keyboard, then you can use Azure CLI. Now, Azure CLI is a cross-platform tool that you can go and install on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and Microsoft provide easy installers for you to do that. Now, the cool thing about Azure CLI is you might do simple commands where you just type it in manually and create a virtual machine, for example, or you might actually have really complex scripts that you go and create that can perform a range of different commands. So we could use these commands and these scripts via some sort of automation, for example. Or you might actually save copies of your scripts and provide them to other members within your organization to make sure that you're deploying resources in a consistent way. It's really up to you how you use Azure CLI, whether it's for your day-to-day management or whether it's for advanced deployments. Now, if you are working with Azure CLI, what you'll find is that the syntax generally follows a straightforward structure such as service, action. So for example, if I want to get a list of all of the different resource groups that are in my Azure subscription, and we'll talk more about what these are later, then I can just type as group list. If I wanted to create a group or a virtual machine or a storage account, it would probably look something like this: as group create, name group 1, location Australia East. So you'll see the idea here is that when you work with Azure CLI, you always type as first, and then the next word is typically the service or the thing within Azure that you want to work with, followed by the operation that you want to perform. And if you need to, you can have additional arguments that are going to help with your configuration, deployment management, whatever it might be. Now again, this is just a really high level introduction so you are aware of Azure CLI, how it works and how you might use it. If you are just getting started, you might also find it useful to use the built-in help commands, which are accessible via typing in --help. So for example, if I wanted to create a virtual machine, I would type in as_vm create, and if I wasn't sure what additional parameters I needed to type in, I can just type in --help, and it will give me all the help that I need to do with that specific command that I just typed. Now, if you're not really sure what type of command you want to enter at all, well, of course you can use Google or Bing, but you could also perform a search through the Azure CLI itself. And we can do that using the as_find command. For example, I might type in as_find and then put in quotes, delete VM. Now that's going to give me a range of help to do with all the different sorts of commands I might enter if I'm trying to delete a virtual machine. Last and by no means least, we have PowerShell. Now, PowerShell is a tool that you actually use to manage Microsoft products, and it used to be something that was only available for Microsoft systems. But if you want to use PowerShell to work with Azure, you can actually go and install the Azure module, which will provide you with all the tools you need to create, manage, and deploy resources within Azure. When we're working with Azure, PowerShell can help us out by providing lots of different functionality through the command line. Now, how does PowerShell compare to Azure CLI? That's a little bit of a tricky question to answer in just a short overview lesson. PowerShell actually provides a lot of different functionality, and in fact, we can even use Azure CLI itself from within PowerShell. PowerShell is an actual shell environment for you to perform command line operations, whether that's working with Azure CLI or even other tools that you've installed that you want to access through a terminal or command line type of interface. Now, specifically when we're working with PowerShell, as I mentioned, this did actually just used to be a Microsoft system. Now, there are still some limitations you might encounter if you are deploying PowerShell to Mac, for example, and some commands that may or may not work the exact same way that you'll see when you Google and find old instructions for Windows. But really what you're starting to see is that PowerShell is really becoming cross-platform. Because you might be asking, why am I going to use PowerShell if it also supports simple to complex deployments, just like Azure CLI? Isn't this just the same as Azure CLI? Well, this is really going to become a preference for you. You could try out both tools, both environments, see which you prefer. PowerShell actually interacts with items in a much different way than Azure CLI, which can help you out when you are building complex scripts or you are trying to interrogate and query data. But really, it's going to be up to you. Try out both and see which you prefer, because PowerShell can now really be used on any different system. So if you do want to give PowerShell a try, what are you going to do? Well, you'll firstly need to install it to your system, and then when you work with the actual PowerShell commands, they follow a different format to Azure CLI. With Azure PowerShell, you're going to follow a verb, noun, argument format. For example, the verb might be install, the noun might be module, and the argument might be as. This is actually one of the first commands that you'll want to enter after you've installed PowerShell, because to get support for Azure when working from PowerShell, you need to install the as module. But what does it actually look like if you've got that installed and you want to work with some resources within Azure? Well, once again, if we follow that verb noun format, for example, if we're creating a resource group, it might look like this: new as resource group, and then all of the arguments for name and location. Now, once again, what can we do if we need help? Well, you can certainly go ahead and Google, or you can use the built-in help command, which is get help. A little bit different from Azure CLI, you're actually going to type in get help, followed by the command that you want to type, and that will provide you with all the necessary information on the command that you are working with. Again, if you're not sure what command you actually want to enter, you can use the get help command to perform a search. You could type in get help and then follow that by some text, for example VM, to go and get some information that relates to virtual machines. So everybody, that's just a quick high-level overview of the different management tools that are available to you. As I've mentioned, we could absolutely have a course on either Azure PowerShell, CLI, or in fact even all of the functionality that's now included within the Azure Portal. But at this stage, it's really just helpful enough to know that these are the different tools that are available to us if we want to go and manage and work with resources. Now, one thing that I haven't included in this lesson that may just be worth being aware of is that of software development kits, or SDKs. If you're going and building your own applications that are going to be working within Azure, then that's where you're going to want to use SDKs. Otherwise, if you're just managing, configuring, and deploying different resources in Azure, you can use the portal, PowerShell, or Azure CLI. Thanks everybody for joining me. I'll chat to you soon.